So let's be clear about HDR. This is not a niche business. This is the future of all video. In 10 years' time, we won't talk about high dynamic range and standard dynamic range. Everything is going to be HDR. Let's be completely clear, which is why we have to get it right now. We can't create a world now where we have certain silos which have proprietary technology in them. You can only do things one way, because this is going to be the future of our entertainment delivery systems from now for the next 100 years. So we have to be very clear. This has to be an open industry where everybody can collaborate, where we create an open workflow from start to finish. That means you can create content in any environment and know that it will play on every single screen. We can't have certain content that only plays on certain screens. That breaks the consumer promise. And at that point, we don't have HDR everywhere. We have HDR for some people and HDR for other people, but not HDR for the masses. And that is a disadvantage to everyone in the entire ecosystem, right? So we need everyone to be able to play. So right now we have a mixed audience. We have a small number of HDR screens and a very large number of standard dynamic range or SDR screens. Over the years, those numbers are going to change. There'll be less SDR screens and more HDR, but we're in this transition period. This transition period is going to last years. That's how long it takes to phase out old equipment and get new ones in. So our challenge right now is, how do you create content in that mixed environment? You've got to create two versions of everything. And our job is to make sure that they both look great. So what we suggest people do is we start with the standard dynamic range. It's available now. It's the one that most people are going to see. Make that perfect. And then separately go back and create the HDR. We don't mix them in. We don't start with the HDR first and force down a version from the SDR or that. We don't do that. Let's create the SDR. Make it as perfect as we can. Then we'll go back and we'll make the HDR. We'll make that as perfect as we can. And then we're going to deliver them off to the consumer. Okay, now we've got two versions of the content which we need to deliver to consumers. And the question is, how do we do that? Well, we've only got one network. And that we have a delivery system. It will allow both versions of the content to run through one network. And if you've got an SDR TV, you get the SDR signal. If you've got an HDR TV, that same signal gives you HDR. Consumer doesn't need to do anything. They just press play. And if they've got a new HDR TV, suddenly they get HDR out of the same signal. It's magic. And that combination of signals, both HDR and SDR, that's the new Technicolor. That is the brand that we're going to push to consumers. You will know when you've got the HDR and SDR combined signal when you see on your content presented in Technicolor HDR. That will mean that if you've only got a legacy TV, you'll get an SDR signal, and it's a great SDR signal, and you'll be able to watch all TV. But if you've got an HDR TV, suddenly that same signal will unlock all the magical extra brightness and darkness and colors from that HDR signal. You will experience Technicolor HDR, which is the first time that we've taken that presented in Technicolor out of theaters and we've pushed it into people's homes. And we've been waiting for HDR to do that. That is the Technicolor promise. High dynamic range is what Technicolor was always about 100 years ago when we invented color in theaters. We're at a pivotal point in this industry. We are making a massive transition from standard dynamic range to high dynamic range. And it's these decisions that last for generations. So we need to make a decision now. Are we going to support an open ecosystem where content, you can make it anywhere and it will play everywhere? Or are we going to allow proprietary systems to creep in where you have to create content in a certain way on certain devices using certain workflows, and then it'll only play back on certain devices that have been licensed by one company? That's not the future that we believe in. We believe that this industry benefited by having an open ecosystem where everybody can compete and play, and all people, all consumers benefit in those sorts of environments.